Day, all day already, with lots of big announcements on restoration of gas, repowering down in Newport, a couple of announcements by the governor and National Grid on small business assistance. The lieutenant governor was just in talking about the need for legislative changes to hold National Grid responsible for these types of incidents and make sure that they don't pass along costs or penalties to ratepayers. And we also had a couple very interesting small businesses on back in the 3 o'clock hour. But the creme de la creme, the icing on the cake, the cherry on the top of the sundae, cha-ching, bing, 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 winning hand, Gary Sasse, the money man, direct from Smithfield and the Hassenfeld Institute. When you're the money man and you're up there at your, is it a tower? Is it an actual ivory tower there in the academic world? Do you jet down to Green and then limo up, or do you helicopter down from the fields up there in Smithfield?
No, I get out of my broom closet, and then I take 146.
And zoom down 146.
Saying prayers all the way down.
Let's start off with, obviously the last 6, 7, 8 days, I guess we're in just past the 7th full week, 7 days and full week of the energy emergency that hit the state. But before that, it was budget. Had conversations with a key staffer over at the legislature today and he said, whew, this budget is a little bit of a redo. That, there's a lot of questions about it. We'd written an editorial about a week ago raising that there doesn't seem to be much of a philosophy behind this budget. It's got taxes here and fees there and increased programs there. It neither seems austere nor growth. It's confusing at best. Your thoughts?
Well, I think it's confusing, but I look at it a little bit differently. I look at it on the spending side. And so the first question you would ask is, what would the governor have the state do, and what would she not have it do?
Yeah.
Who gets what? It's
right.
the basic kind of question. And when you look at that budget, I think it's a very predictable budget of what a campaign was. I give her credit. She, during the campaign, adopted a liberal a liberal spend agenda, and this is basically what it is. Now, we can argue on the merits of the various programs or not, but the focus is on healthcare accessibility. The focus is on education. May not be in the right places, but there's a focus on education. And the focus continues to be on jobs and economic development. So from that perspective, I think it's a very predictable, logical budget. People in the legislature and others may have differences whether she's got the right programs.
So let me ask you a question. Is it the right budget at the right time? Is this a growth budget in a non-growth period?
Well, that's the second point.
Yeah.
So the first point.
You mean I thought to the same level of the money man, almost catching up with the money man?
5 steps ahead. I won't tell you 5 steps ahead. No. So the first question is, the budget is predictable on the spending side. It's a liberal budget. It focuses on what the governor spoke about, the 3 areas I mentioned: health, education, and economic development. The point I was making is there are considerable differences as whether she's got the right programs in those areas, whether they'll be effective. But that's something for the legislature to go through as they review the budget. The second issue, which now that I'm catching up to you, is the fiscal soundness of the budget.
Yeah.
And that's where I think there are a lot of concerns. The first is a bunch of political questions. Where you spend money is political.
But let me ask you a question. She talked about, we'll use Rhode Island Promise as an example, and she talked about it a lot as one of the foundations of why she should be reelected. And she came back and said, well, maybe the budget says maybe we should take it to Rick. Well, if this is your legacy, this is the first year of your second 4 years. It doesn't get any better than this, as you know, for governors, right? The first year of the second 4 years is about the best year you're going to get out of the 4. You get your best chances of passing your legacy type of legislation. And then you say, well, we're not going to take it to you or I. Just that part of it seems somewhat incomprehensible. You also had a milestone in between the two, which was test scores came back and showed that Rhode Island is significantly deficient compared to Massachusetts. And that's the K through 12 argument.
See, and that's the argument about the budget. We're not on the fiscal soundness part. We're back on the spending part.
Right.
Okay, the governor has proposed expanding the Promise program, and yet there's a tremendous amount of controversy, which you guys have reported, as to whether or not it's been successful in the first step. She's not answered the question. We've not had a good discussion as to what the return on investment has been initially. No one's against making education, higher education, more affordable, so the jury is still out on whether the first part has achieved its objectives or not. And then she comes back and suggests, spending additional money to expand the program, to adults at CCRI. I don't want to come back to that thought.
Sure.
And then to Rick, as opposed to URI, and there's no logic for those decisions. At the same time, we're experiencing, really a crisis in how our kids are doing compared to Massachusetts. So the logical question is twofold. Her priorities, number one, are on her Rhode Island Promise program, which helps kids in college, but if they come out of lousy schools, they're going to take a bunch of remedial courses, and the success rate won't be what people want it to be.
And they can't possibly hit a 30 credit, 2.5 grade point average, which, by the way, a 2.5 grade point average at CCRI is not going to get you a transfer into the Ivies.
2.5, there's grade inflation everywhere. There's grade inflation in Harvard.
2.5 is, pretty much, do you have a pulse?
That's the stick, you're right. So, but that's the first point. So she's putting money into this program, which nothing done to improve the public schools. And at the other end of the spectrum, she starts the universal pre-K program. The research says she's right. The research says
Sure.
the kids that go to pre-K programs have a better chance of succeeding than the kids that don't. But the problem is, by the time they're in the second year of the public school, they forget everything they learned in the pre-K program. So you have the main part of your educational system, which is having challenges. We have generations of failing schools. We have generations of underperforming schools. And her priorities are a good program. I'm testing the logic behind the program. Pre-K program. Her program is making education more affordable, and yet in either case, there's no strategy, there's no plan. She hadn't said word one, frankly, of how we're going to fix our education system, what we're going to change. So, to that extent, those are the kind of policy questions the legislature has to deal with. But her putting more money into the programs that you mentioned is what people do right now. Right now, people think we should start education from the cradle to the grave, and that taxpayer has an obligation to pay for college now. That's the liberal orthodoxy right now. That appears in the budget. Not criticizing those programs, but they're predictable. You
Right.
knew that was going to happen. And it's not that it's bad that those are things are being suggested. What is of concern is that we have a broken system in the middle, and there's less chance of those initiatives succeeding. That's the concern.
So let's talk about also from the political standpoint and the strategy standpoint. One of the things that I found unusual and just seems strategically avoidable was the streaming tax. Now, it doesn't affect GoLocal. We're not a streaming paid service, but the so-called Netflix. What's a faster way to piss off more people, especially your core base, young, millennials, etc., than to slap a tax on a streaming service for pennies on the dollars? Out of a nearly $10 billion budget, it was about $4 million, I want to say $3.5 million. It seems misguided and lacked strategy. Why wouldn't there be a strategy to this budget?
Well, it lacks execution. Now, in all honesty, I will admit that in the various administrations I worked in other places, we talked about broadening the sales tax.
Yep.
And we talked about broadening the sales tax to some of the things that she, in fact, has broadened the sales tax to. Mm-hmm. For example, services in commercial, buildings, some other kinds of services, don't recall. But we were very strategic and tactful. And we said, raise a few $1 million and get a bad perception, it's not worth those few million dollars. So, but that's another classic example of not necessarily being wrong in saying we need to broaden the sales tax. So I think now is a bad time to increase tax on anybody, but doing it in a kind of tin air, stone deaf way to what the realities of the economy were. And it's like, getting a lot of squeak from the bird, but not much feathers from that one. So I can't explain that. But the bigger picture of broadening the sales tax, because the retail economy is changing and the state government has to generate revenue, is not a bad idea. It's the execution, it's the tone deafness to what items you choose to broaden the tax to, and how that will play in the world of economic competitiveness.
So in a time in which the economy appears to be cooling to some degree, is it also a time to be able to begin to tighten the belts on some expenditures? Is there a single cut in this budget?
We must have had a conversation before this show because
No, we did not.
this is you're right on track. One of the biggest weaknesses I find in the budget is a total disconnect between the governor's own economic projections and the spending program proposed. So just a couple of numbers. I won't go too much into the numbers. The unemployment rate in the state now is about 3.8–3.9%. In the governor's own forecast in 2023, it's going to be 4.9%.
Yeah.
If you look at the demographics, there's going to be a larger percentage of people that are not in the labor force anymore because just of aging. You look at her own projections, you see the labor participation rate declining among young workers. So all the metrics are used to measure the economic growth. The quality of jobs we're going to create, 25, almost 30%, are going to be generated jobs that pay less than $35,000. So you look at all the metrics, and the metrics say, be cautious, be careful, because if you propose spending in year one when the economy is strong, but your own economic forecast shows a downturn. This is not speculation by somebody. You just say, well, is my program sustainable in year 2 and 3? And then when you come to the answer, well, it may not be sustainable, then you really have to question the judgment of somebody or the politics of putting the program in and getting the announcement made versus what it's going to look like in 3 years. Mm-hmm. And what continues, and I read the budget at a glance that comes out by the House Fiscal staff, and they go into some detail about the out-year forecast, where by 2023, we're projected to have a deficit that'll equal 6.5% of usable state revenue. Now, in fairness to the governor, the size of the deficits, because the economy has been strong, and also because there are a lot of new tax revenue, is not as great as it was projected a year or two ago. But it's still very substantial. It's in real terms, while it's less from a policy perspective, it's not significantly less to make any difference. So we have 5 years of projections where our spending is growing at a much faster rate than our revenues, and we end the period up, with a 6 or 7% deficit that we have to close. Well, that's the classic example of not worrying about the future, not worrying about the future implications of the current decisions that are being made. And so that's the disconnect in the budget. I'm not critical of some of the program things she wants to do. I'm not critical of all the taxes. I think one tax that I think is a great idea, and that's the tax on companies that employ more than 300 people that try to take the cheap and not pay their share of employee health insurance and put them on Medicaid so you and I can pay. That's a tax increase. Yeah. That's probably a good tax increase. And so you got to judge.
It's also a good tax increase if you know all the potential unintended consequences. If 2 or 3 employers pack up and move across the border or somewhere else or decide to offshore it, it's less of a great...
But these companies of 300, there's a difference between somebody coming in, coming 50 people and trying to put their folks on Medicaid than the companies that are on that list. There are about 140 companies, I think, on that list. But that's an equity issue. It's an issue that if you're going to expand Medicaid, you've got to figure out a way to pay for it.
Right.
And those kinds of things seem to be reasonable. So you go through, your point earlier, you go through the budget and you find things that make a great deal of sense. Broadening the sales tax makes sense. It doesn't make sense to broaden it to streamlining. But what is the fundamental underlying issue, which this does not address, is fiscal soundness. And the fiscal soundness question is, if your own economic forecasts show things turning down, no one's fault, natural cycle, why are you have a liberal spending policy? And so what that equals in the old-fashioned way when we used to have Democrats to talk about, it's a typical tax and spend budget. It's going to spend and tax, and you can't get out of a deficit situation by just taxing and spending. If you tax to close your deficit, that's one reason. You have revenue and you begin to narrow your deficit. So in the future you can invest. If you just tax and spend it, then the net deficit doesn't change, and that's the situation that we're in.
I think it's going to be a very, very vigorous review of this budget. I think the budget will come out looking completely different than what was proposed by the governor. I think you'll see some slow deterioration of the economy over the next few months. And as you said rightfully, it's not the governor's fault or anyone else's fault. It's just the natural progression of we've had 10 years of growth.
But then you also look at her economic development budget. And I think that's interesting, too. She's expanding it, but essentially staying the course. And so the question becomes, as the economic cycle changes, don't you think you ought to have other kind of incentive programs? Because the one we've used may not be as valuable if the other ones were indeed valuable during a downturn. And the one I point to, I think there's some interesting things in there. I think they're not at scale. We talked about this during the Kacheri administration. Mike McMahon, who was the director of economic development at that time, was a strong proponent with site-ready development. Now, there's a little bit of that in the budget. There's about, I guess, $2.5 million for a pilot project. That's good. I think making the R&D tax refundable, those are good, positive economic incentives. Putting another $100 million into Rebuild Rhode Island confuses economic development with real estate development. Now, the real estate development is part of economic development. It's not it's not a Berlin Wall between those two concepts.
Right.
But so much of the money that she's requesting, or the authority to use tax incentives and spend, is largely for real estate. Well, is real estate a smart thing to incentivize to the degree that we have been when the economy turns down? It was maybe a smart thing to do when the economy was going up and people took advantage of it, but how that capital investment works in bad times and how real estate as a stimulus for economic development works when the cycle is down needs to be studied by the legislature. I'm not sure they'll do it. They seem to board into that program pretty much.
New numbers came out from Rhode Island Association of Realtors, seeing some cooling in the residential market. Had a conversation with one of the top commercial real estate firms the other day, and he said, listen, 18 was a good year. We moved some big buildings, but there's not a lot of growth. You're seeing hotels. I mean, that's really been the focal point of much of the incentives into the real estate market. So we'll see about that. Let's go to Washington. Beautiful Washington, D.C. Your good friend Roger Stone got into trouble. Did you know Roger Stone?
No, but I knew Charlie Black. The firm that was the leading outside political consultants back in the late '80s, I guess.
Yeah.
Was Black, Manafort, and Stone.
Stone, yeah. They had Ed Dupree.
Yeah, and I'm surprised Charlie Black got stuck with that crowd. He was a pretty confident guy.
Yeah. Yeah, no two ways about it.
No, I don't know. I don't know Roger. No, Roger would. I don't think our personalities would blend.
You do not seem to be the same. I just can't quite imagine it the same way. The shutdown ended on Friday afternoon, shortly after Roger Stone was indicted and arrested and charged, I guess, in Fort Lauderdale federal court. Shutdown happened around 12 o'clock, I want to say. Noon, federal workers started to drift back to work. What's the implications of this, and what are we going to see in whatever it is now, 17 days from now?
Well, I don't. Yeah, the implications it's bizarre. The implications are that those of us who have been critical of president's capacity and ability to lead the free world had those fears.
Reinforced?
Reinforced. Yeah, he's naked for all the world to see. If you get into a situation where you know you have to deal, you always have a backup plan. They had no backup plan. They had no clue where the off-ramp was. I mean, it was just unfortunate to watch. Even just to watch that go forward was very unfortunate. So the president's been exposed to the whole America now is being less than capable. There were some of us that suspected that, but I think it's been exposed. So we've gone 3 weeks. People suffered.
More than a month. The shutdown was more than a
No,
month.
that's right. It was
33 days.
33 days. Finally, the traffic controllers drew attention to it. But what really drew attention to it, which no one talks about, there were about 1,400 IRS people that didn't show up, and money's not being processed. Jerry Maguire, follow the money. So,
Yeah, all right.
and so the president painted himself into a box and didn't have the skills to get out of the box.
Thursday night, I guess it is, excuse me, it has been reported that Mitch McConnell told the president that as many as 6 or more Republican senators were moving away from the president's position, and that Mitch McConnell would not be able to hold them, and that would give Democrats the majority to be able to bring end the closure. It seems unlikely that those 6 or more Republicans are going to change their behavior again and vote and sustain another closure of federal government in 17 days?
So I will tell you this, 6-word plight.
Yeah.
There are other Republicans who have to weigh whether a potential primary challenge from the Trumpians in their state, versus causing some inconvenience to the public, where that balance is. And as time went on, it became very clear. The balance was to fear the primary less. And there are other Republicans that are ready to jump ship. There's no, and then when I say jump ship, they're not jumping off ship and swimming to the other boat.
Right.
It's just on this issue. They're going to jump off. Maybe as the boat is hit by a torpedo, they just soon be in the water. And so that was a real political issue. But see, the consequences to the president are enormous. The things I mentioned before about him getting beaten. Some people said to me that Trump really was a miracle worker. He could change a wall into a cave, so the president lost prestige. The president lost people's confidence. He also, lost, some of the Republican support. They question him more now. And his support among Republicans is still amazingly strong, but it's not at 90% anymore. I'll tell you that. It's down. It's 5 or 6 points lower than that.
So Ronald Reagan, just to remind a few historical facts, Ronald Reagan in 1982 was down at one of the lowest approval ratings and seemed to bounce back pretty darn strong. Bill Clinton, after the failed health care policy, seemed to bounce back pretty strong and had one of the highest approval ratings of presidents. Is there magic to be had by Donald Trump, or is this just going to be a slow decay?
Well, I don't know. In 3 weeks from now, if there's a deal on immigration, and the deal is more than a few dollars for the border wall, but there's a deal on immigration, this could play back. Now, the chances of getting a deal are probably less than 50-50, but if there's a big deal and people think the problem's solved, that'll be healing. You can learn 2 things from the Reagan and the Clinton situation. When Reagan had his low point in popularity...
He was 2 years in.
And the economy was awful.
Terrible.
Horrific.
Awful. Yeah.
And he worked with O'Neill, so his problem was caused not by Reagan, but he just happened to be president when the economy was bad, and he learned his lesson. He went and walked across the aisle, and they worked together. Greenspan did Social Security reform.
Yep.
They did taxes with Tip O'Neill, and so his lesson was, I got to compromise. And Reagan was the one that taught all of us that if I can get 70% of the pie, I'm going to take it. But next week, I'll come back for the other 30%.
Yeah.
And Trump doesn't understand that. Reagan had an understanding of how the institutions worked. He understood Congress's role. He actually liked those people. He respected those people. And so he learned his lesson that he had to walk across the aisle and work on compromise. Clinton's lesson is a little bit different. Clinton got back in power because the Gingrich Republicans overplayed their hand.
Right.
And so Trump has 2 opportunities, because I'm not optimistic about the first. But his 2 opportunities are, one, to work out something on immigration that people think is worthwhile, and second is for the loony left to overplay their hand. And I think the salvation is more in the latter than possibly in the former.
So last night, Schultz, the former CEO, founder of Starbucks, went on 60 Minutes and said that he was considering, very seriously considering, running for president of the United States as an independent. Thinks both parties are too extreme, that they're too vindictive, that there's no place in the middle. By, 7:30 this morning, David Cicilline, congressman from Rhode Island, member of the House leadership, was tweeting at him not to run, he could never win, and that he would ruin it for the Democrats.
Well, see, I think David Cicilline is doing more to ruin it for the Democrats because of the positions he takes. He's a difficult guy to compromise with. Third parties don't have a track record of, or independents, I should say, don't have a track record of doing well. It's a tremendously complicated process. I think Schultz is right that the parties aren't extreme, but the extreme wings have taken over both parties,
Yep.
and people in both parties are pandering to the extremes. Now that can change, and Schultz's paradigm can become inefficient. At this point, I think it would be a healthy thing for him to get into the race, and not because I agree with Schultz. Schultz is a fairly liberal businessman, but if for somebody just to talk about how you solve a problem, for example, Schultz doesn't believe in Medicare for all. Economically, $32 billion
Right.
it just doesn't happen. Somebody used to say people believe in socialism until they spend all your money and they can't do it anymore.
Right.
So it would be helpful if somebody got in the race that would expose a problem, solve a moderate position. It doesn't have to be Schultz. It could be a moderate in the Democrat Party, Biden. It could be a moderate in the Republican Party, Jim Mattis, Rubin. There are a lot of people.
Right.
And so we need somebody to really present the middle position, a kind of problem-solving position. If the parties won't do it, then Schultz does it, whether he wins or not. Does one well running for the presidency, I think that's a service to America by getting us back. I'm active in this group called No Labels.
Absolutely.
And
it's gotten a lot of play recently at the national level.
Right, because our positions are that you got to solve problems, and that compromise is not a dirty word. And I watch our organization get more influential and stronger. And if you translate, and just the House rules changes reflected some of the things that we had to do. And so if you begin to translate that to the election, and the politics started awful early this year, it'll be good to have somebody coming out and say, no, I'm a moderate. We can solve problems. We can work together. This is how we can do it. If Schultz motivates somebody in either party to do it, I think that's better than an independent. If the parties are so controlled by the extremes that can't happen, then that's not a bad alternative. And the David Cicillinis of the world, who are on the left, really politically, and I understand this, don't want the threat of anybody being in an election that'll take away some moderate votes. And they probably fear that they will take more moderate votes away from Democrats, though I'm not convinced of that. I think there are people, not a lot, but there are people who tend to be independents or Republicans that voted for Trump because they were fed up with what was happening in
Depending
Washington.
on the state, 40% of Americans are either registered independent or unaffiliated, depending on the state, because each state treats that differently.
The point that no one talks about, and I don't have any data to base this on, so it's kind of instinct, that he also will take votes away from Trump. Mm-hmm. Because I know a lot of Republicans, not a lot, but I know a number of Republicans who voted for Trump because his name wasn't Hillary.
Yeah.
And voted for Trump because they thought that the swamp needed to be fixed up a little bit.
Well, and the Democrats are going to have a wild complexity on their own side with, the number of candidates who've already declared. I mean, there's already 3 prominent women who have initiated campaigns in some level of significance, and you're looking at multitudes of more. That could be, you could have 20 semi-viable Democratic candidates for President of the United States, and then you've also got, like Schultz, who's a billionaire, you've got Michael Bloomberg, who's really a billionaire, who's got $20 billion or something like that, and could also run as an independent and change the dynamics completely.
And I never understood why Bloomberg felt and he said if he ran, he'd run as a Democrat. I think he said that.
Oh, is he now to a Democrat?
I think And I never understood that because I think he would be a better Schultz. And he served in public office. He was an effective mayor of New York City. People in both parties and independents, acknowledged that he was a good mayor. He has been out on causes, though controversial. He supported Never Trump stuff, particularly the Democrat Party. But his position on gun safety is pretty clear.
Yeah.
And now that brings also people that disagree, but he has a public record.
Yeah.
And he is independent, and his views tend to be more moderate than the mainstream of the Democrat Party right now. So that's a calculation he has to make. I think the point that you're making, whether it's Schultz or some other vehicle, we do need somebody in the country that will draw attention to the need for moderation, the need to solve problems, the need to work together, the need to compromise without necessarily compromising on one's principles.
With that last question, 17 days from now, will we have another government shutdown, or will we have significant real progress on immigration reform? I think it's got to be one or the other.
Well, I think there's a third, but I don't think we'll have a shutdown.
Okay.
Because the cost of this shutdown was so high, and I think the American people, if you look at the polling data, really say, why was the candle worth the game on this shutdown? So that's going to be very hard to have another shutdown.
So no shutdown.
No, but
immigration reform.
Well, there's a middle ground.
Okay, third option.
Third option is semantics, and the semantic option is everybody, they get to a meeting, there's kumbaya. Trump says he's got a wall. Nancy says he has something else, and so they muddle through this, saying nice things to each other, which blows up about the time of the election. But the government.
I would have said that if the first shutdown didn't happen the way it happened, Nancy Pelosi, in the course of 3.5, 4 weeks, has gone from barely reelected. Couldn't the Democrats do any better? She's old and tired. She's not the right face for the Democratic Party, to 1 month later being the most powerful woman in the world, and he had to kowtow to her to reopen the government.
Well, because that shows that he made her stronger because he did not understand the institution.
Yeah.
And though he respects her, he hadn't given a nickname yet.
He has not given, well put, he has not given Nancy Pelosi a nickname.
The sad part of this thing, I'm doing work on debt and some other issues, is that we got some really big problems.
Yeah.
And for the last month, we've been having this partisan food fight, and for no apparent gain. No one gained anything.
No.
Nancy won, but Nancy won the status quo. Keep that in mind. Trump
She won the inside political game in Washington. She didn't win a substantive policy change that would benefit Democratic policies.
Well, she did win the perception game. She's viewed as I think people view her as a more effective leader than our president right now.
Yeah, absolutely.
And the speaker's a strong position. So, she won, he lost. He got into this thing without a strategy, without a plan B, without figuring out where the exit ramps were. And that should concern every American because, this was an important issue, but there are issues that can much more directly endanger our security. And if we have somebody in the White House without a plan B or without a strategy, woe is to us.
Next week we'll pick up on federal debt because I think that's the biggest story that isn't anyone reporting on. Moneyman Gary Sasse, thanks so much for coming in to the Navigant Credit Union Broadcast Center. We appreciate your time, insights, expertise, any loose change you leave on the seat during these visits.
Well, the loose change is to put in their Providence parking meter.
We have open parking meters. We're in downtown Providence in the, quote, financial district. It's 4 o'clock on 4:30 on a Monday, and there are empty parking spots everywhere.
Well, because you got to go to the bank to get a loan to get in the park in downtown Providence these days.
Thanks, everybody, for tuning in. Thanks to the Lieutenant Governor for being in today. Also our folks, small business folks, Mary Sadlier over at Adventures and John Carroll for coming in today. We'll be back tomorrow afternoon. Kate Nagel's got the full lineup. I think she's got 4 or 5 guests talking about just about everything. Thanks for tuning in. Have a great Monday night. Hope those folks down in Newport are all set and are back online.